The other pioneer that's usually part of the Three Musketeers is not here yet, but my mother relocated from Detroit to Charlotte. And so normally you'll see my mother, myself, and my daughter at different events. And it's amazing. I don't think we actually realize the visual image and the importance of just seeing that continuation of the line of Muslims involved in our community. So alhamdulillah for that. I wear many hats in the community. Most of the time I'm involved with strategic planning here with our efforts to grow and develop this masjid. Outside of my day job, I run a company called Circle Communications. It's a coaching, facilitation, and team building company. So I'm happy to be here facilitating today for you. And I would like to pass the mic down and introduce the rest of our panelists. We will be talking about education, lifelong learning, and the importance of expanding our own horizon. So after I pass the mic down, then I'll get into one of my first questions for our audience. Okay, they have microphones. So Naila, introduce yourself.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Alaikum assalam.
So my name is Naila El-Amin. I have a BA in International Studies with a concentration in Peace, Conflict, and Identity. So I'm going to be talking a little bit throughout the conversation about my personal experience in college and also some of my international travel that I've done and self-study. And how some of the things I've learned can be implemented regardless of where you live or your financial abilities. And so I'm happy to be here, happy to discuss a little bit with you all about culture and relationships and language and what all of that entails.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Naomi Shaker Feast. I'm from Raleigh, North Carolina. I kind of got recruited here as I walked in the door, but alhamdulillah. I am an educator. I'm a historian and I do research. I have a background, my educational background. I have an undergraduate degree, North Carolina Central University in sociology, master's degree from Duke University in liberal studies with a concentration on African American studies. I work at Durham Technical Community College with the division College and Career Readiness. I've had just experience in education over the years as the first directress of Muhammad University of Islam in North Carolina, Raleigh, North Carolina, and eventually we became the Sister Clara Muhammad School. And I've been working in the area of education for a number of years. My focus will be on the importance of knowing yourself, and what that entails generally in terms of being able to cultivate, as the theme is, cultivating the growth of human excellence during difficult times. So why is education important in that process of cultivating self, knowing self?
Assalamu alaikum. Like my sister Naomi, I was recruited coming in the door as well. So my name is Fitrah Muhammad, and I'm a lifetime member of this community. I was raised up from the age of 15. I produce a program called Study Al-Islam. I work at Masjid Muhammad in Washington, D.C. in the capacity of international relations, and I'm getting ready to recruit this young sister over here. I am an international traveler. I have probably traveled to about maybe 23 countries, and I worked in Saudi Arabia for over a year. In the field of education. I'm not officially an educator, but as mothers do, we are nurturers of mind, and I certainly walk in the shoes of many great women that taught me. So I'm going to talk to you about Study Al-Islam and the focus that our focus will be on raising the visibility of the women the voices of the women in this community. So I am happy to be here in North Carolina. This has been indeed a pleasure for me.
Alhamdulillah. Thank you so much for introducing yourselves and for both of you for joining our panel. I think some of you may know Sister Rhonda was not able to join us, so we had to kind of fill in, and alhamdulillah for you joining us. So my first question, and the prizes are Dicker beads. These were donated by my sister-in-law, Leah El-Amin of Marietta, Georgia. And so the first question is, give me a Quranic quote on education. The first person to give me a Quranic quote on education. Okay.
Well, it would be obviously the first revelation that came to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Surah 96 of the Quran, Iqra.
Can you all hear him?
Oh, okay. Assalamu alaikum. So I'm saying that obviously that would be the first revelation that came to the Prophet Muhammad, the first 5 ayats of the Quran, Surah 96 of the Quran. And we all familiar with that. Iqra, read in the name of your Lord who created you, and created you from clot, or maybe Imam Muhammad said don't use clot of congealed blood, so that would be the first in terms of actually education that was given to the Prophet Muhammad, but it was also revelation that was given to us as human beings. So I'll stop with that.
Thank you very much. Now you have a choice. You want this color or this color?
Well, I can't see any one of the colors, so whatever you want to give me, I just accept it.
There you go. Alhamdulillah. Okay. And it looks like I may have dropped something. Oh, my notes. All right. So let me get another question. A favorite quote about education. It can come from Hadith or Quran. Another quote.
What about Rabbi Zilni Ilma?
Allahu Akbar. And would you like to translate for us?
Oh Allah, increase me in knowledge.
Alhamdulillah. And do you have a preference of color? I'm going to speed this up so we can get to our presenters.
Green.
Okay. I'll take one more, and then we have some other quizzes. Okay. One more. Favorite Islamic quote that comes from Hadith, and we'll actually try to get someone else.
Oh, okay.
One more. Anyone else? Okay, let's get into, we have more questions later. So I'm going to let Naila start. She has a mic. And we will move it along because we do have some other presentations, but we also want to give you a chance to ask a question or two. So Naila?
All right. So one of the things that we were talking about was the disconnect that happens sometimes between learners of all ages and curriculums that are taught in traditional classroom settings, and understanding what, if we take U.S. history or U.S. government, what does that mean for the average person that's having to learn this? Sometimes education can feel like a top-down experience. You can feel like you're being talked at and not feeling like that's relevant to lived experiences that you've had. And I think I've had that personally happen in the classroom. I've seen it with some of my students that I've taught. And I know that anyone who's an educator has definitely seen that. So we had a couple of questions. I randomly pulled up a U.S. government high school final exam. And so we are going to see if anyone can get the correct answers to a couple of these questions, and then talk about what that really means and the importance for our day-to-day lives. So the first question on this random exam that I found was, how many total electoral college votes are there in the United States during an election? National one. A little bit louder. Come on, confidence. Confidence. 114. Do we got anybody else? 102. Anyone? All right, so I'm going to give you all the multiple choice. I probably should have done that to begin with. So, is it 270, 538, 438, or 358? Look at you. All right now. Hold on.
Okay. Is that right?
We're all wrong.
Wait a minute. Uh-oh. I gotta get back.
It's two. Oh, you know what it is? Let her keep it. It was a trick question. So, you need to, if you're in a presidential election, you have to have 270 of the Electoral College votes in order to become president. There are actually 538 total with all 50 states, but the first person to reach 270, that's why we all knew 270, so it's okay, you get to keep it. The first person to hit 270 is the person that is the president-elect. So that's what it was.
That's how he got it.
Listen, I graduated in 2013. I should have known it before y'all, but, you know. All right. This is an election held in order to fill a position that became vacant between regular elections. Semi-open primary, special election, general election, closed primary, or open primary. Who was first?
I think it was assistant purple.
Okay. Yes, you got it correct. Thank you. All right, and we're going to do, let's do one more. This is actually a really interesting question. What defines the ruling class as an aristocracy? Aristocrats could define their exclusive faction by anything from wealth to political parties to social class, owning land and having hereditary noble titles, being elected by the citizens, or being related to a specific political party. What defines the ruling class in an aristocracy? Owning land, family.
The choices again?
So the choices are aristocrats could define their exclusive faction by anything from wealth to political parties to social class, owning land and having hereditary noble titles, being elected by the citizens, or being related to a specific political party. Who said owning land? Sister Michaela. And wealth. So owning land and having hereditary noble titles is how you are a part of the aristocracy. So you were correct.
So do we have two?
Do you want to speak to why we did the government exam? Why we wanted to talk a little bit about?
Okay, so we can do that. Yes. So why did we use these examples around government, civics and government? Well, you just participated in workshop that dealt with citizenship or government with Brother Nassif and Brother Alameen, commissioner and our representatives. So I'm sure they talked to you about the importance of being good citizens. Imam Muhammad has said, with citizenship comes responsibility. With citizenship comes responsibility. So part of the responsibility of being a good citizen is having a knowledge of how government works. You can't really see how, I've heard so many, I work in an environment with young adults at the community college, and a lot of them might say, well, I don't need to register. Why should I register? My vote won't count. I'm sure you've heard that. My vote won't count. Well, your vote really does count, because we just got through listening to her about how many electoral votes are needed, to become president. It's 270. So when we go to the polls in the general election, we're voting for that candidate, be it the Democrat or the Republican, whichever candidate and whatever party gets the majority vote in that state. I think North Carolina has 16 electoral votes. California has something like 55. Texas has something like 36. So that is how our current president got to be in the White House, because he won the most electoral votes. He did not win the popular vote. In other words, more citizens in America voted for Hillary Clinton, but they were in states that had the least number or the lower number of electoral votes. Therefore, she did not get the electoral vote count of 270. So it does matter, especially in these big, these states like California, where they have huge populations. That is why that citizenship, the census is so important. Because once they count how many people live in a given state, that helps to determine how many electoral votes you get, how many representatives you get for your state to go to the House of Representatives. It's based on population. Every state gets 2 senators, but the number of representatives that you get is based on the population. So if there is an effort to undercount the people in your state, you can either, you won't have as many numbers, and therefore you may lose the number of people represented in for your state in Washington. So you must understand how how civics and citizenship and all of that works. It is so related. So Imam says, with citizenship comes responsibility. So when they pass out those census papers, we need to fill them out and be counted. Because if the state has an undercount, we could lose the number of representatives that sit in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. And that is kind of that whole argument behind voter suppression. Because if you don't have enough people voted into the House of Representatives, you have a lower number, then you don't have as much influence on bills that are being introduced and are gonna, trying to be passed. So that is why we included that, having a knowledge of citizenship. I work with young people, and they have to take a battery of tests. The class that I work with is called high school equivalency. So students have to prepare to pass either the battery of GED test or HiSET. And under both of them, there is a social studies component. In the social studies component, you may be questioned about any of these content areas. It could be geography. Most people don't know where things are in the world, places are. Like Colorado. Or, like one student asked me, where is the Sahara? And she was pointing on the map up near the Arctic. I said, the Sahara is not near the Arctic, okay? It's in Africa, so knowing where places are. So you have geography, economics. 50% of the GED social studies test is composed of civics and government, 50%. 20% is made up of questions on U.S. history, okay? And the other 30% is between economics and geography. So having that knowledge, knowing and learning is so important. Some people might say, well, how's that going to benefit me when I get out here to get a job? Well, if you're in international studies or you're working with, you need to have some general knowledge of these things. So we wanted to incorporate some questions about the importance of citizenship, knowing about civics, and the importance of becoming good citizens. It's just good to have that general knowledge, background knowledge. And we'll talk more about the importance of knowing about self and how that fits into the importance of being good citizens and being able to feel like you are a part of, you have to see yourself in the story. If you don't see yourself in the narrative, then you might not feel like you really have anything to say. I don't need to vote. It won't make a difference.
So I'm going to pose a couple of questions, but and let me do that while you pass the mic down. One of the questions which may help lead in sharing some more information about ongoing education and learning for Muslims is just around the notion of cultivation. We know that as women, we're the first teachers, but as individuals, whether you're male or female, we have responsibilities for continuous learning, not just learning civics or how to be a good citizen, but also just continued growth to know why Allah put us here, what our purpose is in life, and also how to continue to spread the knowledge of Al-Islam. So with the mic, if you would talk a little bit more about why you think cultivation is so important and how we can continue to cultivate ourselves and continue to grow as Muslims.
So Study Al-Islam was created to promote and educate on the Quran, the life examples of Prophet Muhammad, and to preserve the authenticity of Imam Muhammad's language and tafsir. So in order to be on Study al-Islam, you need to be a member of this community, this one ummah across the United States of America and abroad. And it's made up of two programs. It is Life Topics, which is on subject matter that is relevant to our everyday life, and Ramadan, which comes once a year, and it's lectures for 30 days. The importance is that we believe that Imam Muhammad, may he be in the highest place in paradise, was gifted with spiritual knowledge that led us to the Quran. And with that belief, I have created this program with the support of the imams and sisters who have been speakers on this program. And actually, we have Dr. Nuruddin in the back who has spoke on Study al-Islam. We have Imam Naeem, who has had a presence and presentations on Study al-Islam. And they have been, their lectures and talks have been around that format, the three different aspects. The preservation of our existence, our history, is so important because under the leadership of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, he taught us based on the condition that we were in and brought us out of that condition based on a knowledge that we all have to agree now in looking at the end result thus far is that he was divinely guided. It is no way that we would have educated young sisters like we have sitting here. We'd have these imams that only spoke English and now are masters of the Arabic language. We have great programs that Ash-Shaheed has. We have great leadership in so many different aspects. So it is the evidence of what has been produced along this pathway that is so relevant to us embracing our history and preserving it. And so for a long time, we have been shamed by others for the pathway that we have been on that has delivered us to the Quran and the study of Prophet Muhammad. But when you do what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you in the Quran, and you begin to talk to other people of other cultures, you realize that they too have a story that brought them to the path of where they are. And that is what helps you to understand how important your path is. It will also help you to believe that you are the answer to most problems here in America because we survived these very conditions that most people find themselves in right now and are searching for answers. We have the answers to that because if it was left up to the slave master or those who enslaved us after they were finished with us or could no longer hold us legally, they would have, exactly, we would not live to see today. So the preservation of our history and the furtherance of our education is really based on our humble beginnings and that we are able to see God's hand in our existence. Because without seeing God's hand in our existence and our connection, as Imam Muhammad used to tell us, we have to learn to connect the dots. And the way that we do that is not to just look at the end of what we have, but connect it back to how we got started, which is why we are moving the program on Study al-Islam to raise the visibility of women's voices. And our dear sister Naomi, who will be speaking on Study al-Islam, is not going to be speaking to the community of North Carolina only. She's going to be speaking on how to preserve your history to the over 350 people that call in every week. And inshallah, she's also going to be going on Mark Shaheed's program, 360, to also talk about it. So
Thank you for letting me know. Okay, so alhamdulillah. This sister said it so beautifully. Yeah. She said it so beautifully. We have a beautiful, rich history. We have a beautiful, rich narrative, so we can't let anyone make us feel ashamed of our history, our path, the way Allah chose for us to come to this faith. We can't be ashamed of that. And we don't have to adapt or adopt or take on anyone else's way, because Allah created us all equal. And Allah chose this path for us. Our leader has said education is the #1 priority. Yes. It's the #1 priority, and I just have to take my hat off to Brother Adam Biar. If you're not aware, if you check Muslim Journal, he has something called 150. So he tries to get 100 people to send $50 to a Sister Clara Muhammad school each month, and he says which school your money should go to for this month. I think this particular month is Nashville, Tennessee. So if you haven't begun connecting to that, please do. But our history is so important, and this whole notion of cultivating, it's very difficult to cultivate yourself toward excellence if you really don't know who you are. You don't know your history. You don't have a good knowledge of where you came from. And so that idea is what has driven me. Really, I've always had an interest in history, but it was Allah inspired me to begin to work on a project in 2017 because I saw a need. You know, the buzzword for a long time has been about Islamophobia. I'm sure you've heard it. Islamophobia, and you know, it's like this fear that everybody's supposed to have about Islam since 9/11. And typically, the Muslims that are approached, national radio, TV, whatever, there are Muslim brothers and sisters who are from the immigrant community. I don't know how often we have had an opportunity to address that issue. But while all of that is going on, we must preserve, we need to document, preserve, and share our history. And that is a project that I was blessed to start in 2017. By the grace of Allah, it's like, well, what, you know, I know something about the history because I'm a pioneer. And, you know, when I came in 1971, so I know a little bit about the history in the area where I am. But as I looked at young people coming in these recent years, the history, I mean, who knows the history? Who's telling them the history? So it's important to document it and to share it. And so that is something that I have been blessed to begin by interviewing our pioneers, collecting, scanning documents, artifacts, things of that nature, and putting together exhibitions that can be shared. Long-term goal is to have something published that we can use in our weekend schools on our history. But there are people who are doing this in little pockets here, little pockets there, but we don't know each other necessarily. So at some point we need to come to know each other and how can we help each other. But it's very important that we know who we are, Our story is not the master narrative. When our children go to school, that's not the major narrative that they see in the textbooks. Our leader told us we need to write. We need to publish. So that is our story. It's important. We have to tell our story. We can't let someone else tell our story because it won't be right. It won't be our story, it'll be somebody else's story. So our story has been the sidebar, you know, the little margin. And I'm not talking about just us as Muslims. You might find one or two paragraphs. But even just the African American story gets a little bar somewhere on the side of in the margins of the textbook. Well, why aren't we writing textbooks? Why aren't we on the textbook advisory board to select textbooks for our district or have some influence? When we are good citizens, then we think about that. We want to make a change. You know, you have to be in the room where it happens. Is that a part of the Hamilton's thing? You got to be in the room where it's happening. Yes. And sit on some boards and commissions. So let me encourage us to do that. First, we want to know our story, make sure we are documenting it and sharing it, and be in a position to have some influence. Thank you. I didn't mean to talk so long.
Thank you so much for sharing. So I get to ask another question. So this is kind of a fun question. Name 3 movies that you have seen. The first person to name 3 movies that you've seen that encouraged you to learn more about history.
I've seen Roots.
Hold on, let me get over there. Okay, so we'll say television as well as big screen.
I've seen Roots. I've seen Harriet Tubman. I've seen the early part of
I was
it.
going to say, how'd you see that one? It's
The,
not
ear-
yet.
the early part of it. They always talk about Harriet Tubman. And I've seen I guess I only got 2.
I'll take one more so you all can think while she's thinking. Come on, give me a third one. I ran all the way over here. Which one? Discovery World. You're going to have to come on with a third one if you're going to get a prize. Okay. Okay, 3 movies. Nat Turner. Amistad. And American Revolution. Okay. Thank you very much. Here you go. And before we wrap up, I also want to get a list of books because we're all about lifelong learning and we're all reading some interesting books. So I'll get some books from the panel and some ideas from you. But before I do that, I'm going to ask Naila a question. Naila, let's see. See, I get to put my daughter on the hot seat. Why has history been so important to you? And why has travel been so important to you? And what have you learned from your international travel?
Okay, it's going to be a long answer. So when it comes to history, I have kind of always been a history nerd. In high school, I took AP US History, AP Government, AP World History, and then I was in the National History Honor Society or something like that, whatever it was called back in the day.
Back in the day.
Listen, for me, okay, just personally, 2013 was back in the day. Okay, so I was talking to Sister Naomi a little bit about one of the most important books I think I've read, which was, it's called A People's History of the United States, and it's written by Howard Zinn. And you can tell I'm a history nerd because I have different scholars who are my favorites. After you get stuck on some of the academic journal publishing websites for a while in international studies, you start to have favorite people that talk about history. And the reason that I enjoy that book is because, number one, it was written by a minority, Howard Zinn, who's already passed away, I believe, but he's Jewish. And so when he approached the idea of talking about United States history, he looked at it from the perspective of those who were not at an advantage. So it starts discussing Native Americans and the arrival of Columbus in Central and South America, and then it talks about the experience of enslaved peoples. It talks about, even when it talks about white men, it talks from the perspective of indentured servants. It talks about it from the perspective of those who bought into the idea of independence from Britain, even when it wasn't necessarily going to benefit them. Because that idea of kinship with the elite because of your skin tone and closeness in culture, and what that actually meant after there was the American Revolution, and how those promises that our founding fathers made weren't necessarily delivered on, and how that influences American culture in the way that people who are at a disadvantage but also have certain identities that may be beneficial, like being considered white in the United States, is an advantage or a privilege. How even when you have that, you see this backlash that happens to minorities, for example, when they feel like, oh, they're stealing our jobs. That's one they like to use on the immigrant community a lot of the time. And it's not necessarily that someone coming over from Central America is coming to take a factory job. It's that, one, you have companies who are run by wealthy white people who are taking their jobs down to Central America or busing people in from Mexico, which is very common when it comes to agriculture. And so being aware of the way that history has happened in the past influences the way I look at things that happen in the media now. And something else that, when it comes to travel, my thesis for my bachelor's degree was on Costa Rican national identity, and the idea of exceptionalism and how immigration has impacted Costa Rican culture. And I studied abroad in Costa Rica, for anyone that doesn't know that about me. And it was interesting because I found that Costa Ricans consider themselves to be white. And so with a degree like international studies and my concentration in kind of looking at race politics and how that influences international ties and culture, I found it interesting that Costa Rica ended up modeling itself on white exceptionalism in the United States. And so understanding history in the U.S. helped me to better parse out the experience of Costa Rican nationals and what they're experiencing with an influx of immigration, similar to some of the rhetoric that we see happening surrounding Central American immigration into the United States. And so I think it's interesting. Whenever I've traveled abroad, one of the benefits is being able to talk to people who have a completely separate experience from you. When I lived in Costa Rica, I stayed with a woman who, her father was Lebanese. So she was so excited to have a Muslim living in her house. And she told me, she was like, the masjid's right down the street. It was like a tiny little house that was like around the corner. And I think I only met one person, and the woman was Lebanese as well. And so she only spoke Arabic and Spanish. And with my broken Spanish at the time, I did my best to introduce myself and build a relationship. But it's interesting to see the way other people experience the world and how that comes across in conversation. So when I was kind of thinking about what to talk about on this panel, I was thinking about the way Spanish is different from English and how language, a lot of the times, you can see what a culture places emphasis on depending on what words they use, if they have multiple words for a similar concept. And you can also see that in Arabic. One of the things that I appreciate about our community and our leadership is being able to question and try to better understand symbolism and meaning within the Quran. And so I grew up listening to lectures and conversations about not just the literal meaning of a word or the literal meaning of an ayat that you might find, but actually digging further into that and what does that mean for the human experience? What does that mean for our relationships? What does that mean in family life? And so I think that has been one of the things that I credit this community with and something that I've taken into my studies and taken into travel, and it's allowed me to better understand the person that I'm speaking with, and also not to center white narratives when it comes to my academia or the study that I do. I dislike when it comes to history, and this is one of the reasons that I think I kind of got into it, is I rejected having to listen to only a white man's narrative when it came to the history of this country, because I knew that my people had been here since the start and that our experience had value that other communities needed to hear and understand. Gratefully, in my undergraduate studies, I was able to bring that conversation out a little bit more, because thankfully, if you have an international study, if that is your track that you're taking in college, you tend to have a more diverse classroom than you would get in other areas. I went to University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and that university is probably like 70% white, but you enter into a classroom that's on Islam, for example, and you have other Muslims in your class, which is super exciting for me, that are also coming from different experiences. You have military people that want to have a better understanding of those that they're interacting with when they're deployed. I met people who were atheists and were there to understand why someone would blow themselves up, for example, and decided to take that as their extracurricular. But we got to have so many conversations in those classroom settings, and I don't think that that's something that should be limited to those that decide, number one, who are 17 or 18 and have to go to college before they enter into a diverse classroom environment, and also not only for people who want to go into history or sociology or psychology and studies like that. I think that these are conversations that are important when you talk about biology or pre-med. I read an article that I know I'm talking, I'm sorry. I read an article that was talking about bias that still exists against Black women in the medical field, and how Black mothers are at greater risk of dying during childbirth, not only because there's just one of the main reasons is that there's still bias that Black people feel less pain. And also when you compound that with the idea of the strong Black woman, and also the idea that Black women can be dramatic or loud, a lot of the times the concerns that are expressed are ignored. Warning signs are overlooked because of preconceived notions or biases that people entering into the medical field have. And so having a diverse awareness of the world and understanding history is extremely important. It's important to understand who Henrietta Lacks was when you're talking about the medical community and the ways that African Americans have been treated by the medical community, and why there may be people who don't want to go get their physicals. They don't feel like they're being heard. It's expensive. And I think those things are really important. So that's why I always get really passionate and start going on ramblings when I get a chance to talk about diversity and culture and some of my experiences. So I'm going to stop talking now so my mother can wrap up.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Naila. Okay. So Naila talked about one of her favorite books. I'm going to ask you
right.
your favorite book,
Wow.
and you as well.
Okay,
And then we'll wrap it up as a
Yes.
panel and give our audience here a chance to ask a couple of questions.
Okay, I don't know about favorite book, but this came to my mind when you asked about some books that I had read that left an impression. And one is, it's entitled Servant of Allah. This is the story of Ibrahim, the slave that was captured, and there's a movie, a documentary done on him, Prince Among Slaves. This book was written by Dr. Sylvain Daouf. I think it's maybe the second or the third edition that she has out, but she does in-depth research on Muslims in America and their experiences. And just as a sidebar, we know that the Muslim from North Carolina that has gotten a lot of recognition from that era, that antebellum era, slave era, is Omar ibn Said. And we know we have a masjid named in memory of him in Fayetteville. And his original documents now are with the Library of Congress. So anytime you want to do research on him, you can just go to the Library of Congress. But Sylvain Diouf talks about him. She talks about Ibrahim Sori, the man that was called the Prince. And then there's another book, Muslims in America. What is it? American Muslims in Antebellum America. That's what it is. Muslims in Antebellum America by Alan Austin. So all of that deals with the history of Muslims in America prior to our current period of time. This was back in the 1800s and 17 when slavery was the norm. But there were Muslims. It is said that maybe 25% of those enslaved brought in were Muslims. About 25% of those people brought in were Muslims. And so they have left their legacy, their footprint. It's a matter of digging in now and trying to identify who were those people. What have they left behind? You know, and if you get on that corridor, it's called the Gullah Geechee corridor on Highway 17, you know, starting up in Wilmington and running down to Georgia, parts of Georgia. You will find little remnants of the history of Muslims being in America. And that's something that we can talk about at a later time. It's a lot.
Oh, my goodness. I'm so intrigued. I'm looking forward to learning more about that.
Yes.
And your favorite book?
My favorite book is Talking to People. I love talking to people of diverse cultures, backgrounds, places. But my father, Dr. Salam, had one of the first bookstores in our community called Books and Things. And my favorite books growing up was Maududi. And Fatul Gulen is also one of the authors that I read his books. But all of the things that our young sister here talked about is how I get my schooling, is by sitting down and talking to individuals when I travel and getting their firsthand experiences about themselves and their ancestors and all of their stories that they are willing, their personal stories that they're willing to share. So, but in terms of, from an academic standpoint regarding Islam, I tend to read Ronald Shaheed's books, and further back than that, I tend to read Maududi and Fatul Gulen, and of course, Imam W.D. Muhammad.
Alhamdulillah. And so before we get into questions, do we have one or two of you that want to mention a favorite book that you think we all should know about? No one mentioned the Holy Quran? Well, I'm assuming that we all took it for that's our favorite book. It's like, okay, we know that's the favorite, but then all the other ones. Alhamdulillah. Yes, the Holy Quran. Alhamdulillah.
May I make one little comment?
Sure, thank you.
Our leader, Imam Muhammad, has advised us to study the rise and fall of civilizations. And I'm sure he did that for a reason. Everything has its day. They rise, civilizations rise, grow, reach their peak, and then they fall. And so if we study what's going on in our environment as we are cultivating our communities, building model community life, if we study the rise and fall of civilizations, then we have to be conscious. It will help us to be more conscious of the pitfalls so we don't fall into some of the same traps that other civilizations have fallen into to cause their demise.
Alhamdulillah. I'm glad you mentioned that. And I have some smarts. I mean, I don't know if I'm as much of a brainiac as Naila, but when I think of, I love movies, right? So when I grew up in the first experience, we weren't allowed to watch movies. And so then when the green light went on and we could watch movies, I think my brothers and sisters and we started gobbling them all up. And so for me, I love learning. I'm a lifelong learner. I actually taught at the community college level as well as at UNC Charlotte. So I love learning and I love being around, particularly adult learners. But I look at movies, and some of the information that's either in the current environment or in movies makes me want to go back and read about Aristotle, or makes me want to go back, because when I was in middle school, some of that stuff was boring because I couldn't connect to it. I didn't see how it related to me. So, I guess whatever works for you to make you go back and study and read. Sometimes it's a conversation, or sometimes it's saying, why did the president say X, Y, and Z? And is there any truth to that? And you go back and you read it and go, wait a minute. Well, no, we all knew it wasn't true. But, where are people getting their information so that you can be educated and having conversations with them in the best way? When I raised my 3 children with my husband, one of my goals was to know Islam enough and teach Islam enough and expose them to Islam so they didn't experience what I experienced growing up, about people saying, oh, you worship the devil, or, all these things that happened when I grew up. And so for me, it's so delightful to hear my daughter be so educated, not only about history, but all about Islam and about our experience and our connection. And so alhamdulillah for that. So with that, I'm going to find out if you have any questions of our panelists. Michaela.
I have a question for Naila as it relates to your education in peace, diversity, and cultural identities and conflict resolution. What is your ideal role or your job in the way that you would like to apply your training in order to create a higher sensitivity of other cultures and diversities within the workplace?
So thank you for that question. So one of my most recent roles was I was a student leader intern for Freedom Schools in Charlotte, North Carolina. I worked at Montclair Elementary School, which is predominantly Hispanic. And it helped kind of hone in how I actually kind of feel like I stumbled into the educational field. It's a benefit of having a liberal arts degree, but yeah, there's a beetle. Sorry, y'all. But one thing that I found is I had students who, because they were Hispanic, and were immigrant, didn't understand if they were black, if they were white, because that was the only cultural context they were experiencing and seeing. We had a very diverse curriculum, but it was geared towards African Americans because it came out of the Freedom School movement that happened during the Civil Rights era. And I found this gap where this cultural conversation that needed to happen wasn't happening within the school system. These students were being left out of even what was considered to be a diverse curriculum because they didn't necessarily fit into that experience or that conversation. So while I'm still figuring out exactly what role or what track I would take, I do want to be in an environment that is diverse and that allows for or encourages conversations surrounding culture and identity and what that means, because they have serious implications for the way that our world operates. When I was looking at Costa Rica and it's modeling itself off of the white supremacy that was present in the United States, the thing that sparked me choosing that as my topic was after I returned from Costa Rica, I saw that there was a riot that happened in a park that I visited almost every weekend when I lived there. and they were throwing Molotov cocktails at refugees and people seeking asylum from the dictator government that's in Nicaragua because they heard that they were burning the Costa Rican flag. A rumor went around that they burned the Costa Rican flag, and they ended up modeling themselves almost like the terrorism of the KKK and trying to understand how important the way that we approach our national identities and our personal identities when it comes to intercultural relationships and interactions. Because the things that, that idea that history repeats itself, if we don't learn from the things that have happened before, and if those conversations aren't brought out into the light and we're not critical in the way that we think about our relationship with the world around us, it will continue to happen. Genocide will continue to occur. Cultural conflict will continue to happen. We will still have xenophobia and racism present, and it will just be a cyclical cycle because we aren't being honest and open and aware of our own personal biases and the biases of other people. So that's kind of the thing that I talk about a lot.
May I say a little?
And do you see yourself potentially, creating a consulting business or something for yourself where you can go into different settings, whether it's a workplace setting or a school setting or just a community setting, to present on culture, diversity, racism, and then just the impact on how those policies of that organization may be put together because of that?
Yeah, I would hope to. Inshallah, I would be able to either join an organization or create one that focused on diversity, inclusion, that I kind of want to say that's real. Because this has always been my passion, almost every job I've had has been diverse on the surface. I have been a brown face for people to put out into the media and say, hi, look, we have a diverse, inclusive environment. Look at all these young people who are brown and doing work. But when you actually look at the leadership, when you actually look at the work that I was asked to do, it didn't reflect what was said. It's very easy for different organizations to say we're diverse, we're inclusive. We believe in having a world that is multi-ethnic, multicultural. It's very different for that to be put in action, and sometimes it's very difficult for companies to even be to do what they aspire to be. Sometimes simply because they don't have the tools, and other times because white supremacy and I would say like ethnocentric attitudes are pervasive, and you find them in areas that you aren't expecting. And also, if you have a level of privilege, you can't always see the biases that are present and that you have. So I would like to be able to point that out and kind of encourage organizations to be more conscious and aware of the ways and intentional in the ways that they approach diversity. Because right now I think we've decided that having brown faces is enough. And I'm also very conscious of the fact that I found that in certain environments, I've been kind of put out there as like, look, we have a diverse face. And I'm like, well, I want my darker skinned sister to be able to speak on what racism is. I'm not the only person that has experienced that. I want my immigrant brother or sister to be able to speak to what it means to walk around and being visibly different. And I think it's very easy sometimes for companies to ignore that or to pass that off. And so that's kind of my passion, and maybe I'll find a space where I'm able to express that.
I like that, not just find a job, but maybe create a job.
Absolutely, yes, yes, yes.
Alhamdulillah.
I just wanted to say something about this diversity and inclusion. There are companies that have now added that as a component to their hierarchy, their structure, and that's important. But we can't ever forget that we have been encouraged to do for self. So creating that kind of company or business, but just creating businesses where we are now competing with these other companies. I know it's going to be generational over time, but just putting in our minds that we need to create our own companies to compete on the world market so that we don't have to necessarily deal with this inclusion and diversity issue. We are we are the company.
Right.
And also STEM. I know a lot of people are pushing science, technology, engineering, and math, to our children, but we have to remember we want balance. Everybody can't be a scientist. For the society to be balanced, we need people who deal with human excellence and building good human. Yes, we have to have balance.
We have a question over here.
Yes, I want to commend your panel, outstanding panel, for all the great commentary on education. I have a statement and also a question to all of you. As you know, Imam Muhammad, he once stated, he said, in definition is direction, And so, and he also said that education is number one priority. So did the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. So did Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He said it in the Quran too. I'd like to take this to the home life, the home environment in terms of education. I know it's mentioned that the mother is the first teacher. I go a little bit further and say, not only is the mother the first teacher, she's the first leader also in the home life. And in constructing a learning lab on parenting and family reconstruction, I define parenting as the process of nurturing and cultivating not only the physical, but the moral, the emotional, the rational, the intellectual, the social, and the spiritual development of our children from infanthood to adulthood. My question to all of you, how would you define education and the role and responsibility, of parents in parenting?
Thank you. Because of time in the next workshop, we'll have to have that be our last question. So I'm going to ask each panelist to answer that, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you.
That is a very heavy question.
Answer it in 1 minute.
Yeah. No, I'm actually going to be very concise on this one, hopefully. When it comes to the role of parents in the education of children, I think that one of the most important things is to see that little spark of interest that your child has with any given thing, and nurture that. Because the idea that every child is going to become an engineer or a doctor is not necessarily going to help the community at large. And I know that I personally would not, I barely passed chemistry, y'all. Like, it was rough. So, but I do think that one of the things that I'm really grateful for is my parents saw the spark that I had for diversity. And I kind of call myself a triple threat because I'm Black, female, and a Muslim. So I was like, well, I already have 3 strikes against me. I kind of saw them as advantages because I love to talk about things that made people squirm. I was always like, I would talk about politics when I was, younger. I would talk about like what it means to be Muslim. I mean, I didn't have a choice. I had a girl tell me, she was like, oh, Naila, I'm really sad that you're going to go to hell. And I was like, well, that's great. That was like 3rd grade. But when I come home and I tell that story, or I mention something that happened in school, and I don't look devastated by it, I actually look kind of interested in the way that I'm supposed to respond to a question like that. That was nurtured, and I was put in an environment of interfaith, and I was able to learn how to use my voice to talk about different things. So I say find that spark. If you have a child and you notice that they're really interested in this one concept in math, they found that really interesting, they found it kind of cool, they liked being able to figure out algebra, encourage them, tell them how Muslims are the ones that created algebra as a concept of mathematics. Introduce them to a person that you may know or a program you may heard about that would encourage them to keep going, because I think that's the thing that will spark that joy for learning in a child. Not every child is going to be completely interested. You know, when it comes to like English and they assign your kid like Charles Dickens in freshman year of high school and they're like, Great Expectations is not interesting to me. It's one of my favorite books, but it's not interesting to a child that you may have in your home. Give them a book that speaks to their experience. Give them something that speaks to what their interests are, and I think that will really help.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll try to make this short, inshallah. Well, how would I define education? I would define education as a discipline. A discipline that is used to develop the intellect of the human being. My understanding is that intellect is that part that Allah wants us to grow. That's a very important part of the human being, is the intellect. So it's the discipline of education helps that process of developing the intellect. And to further comment on as far as parenting is concerned, understanding all the things you've said about mother being the first teacher, the cultivator, that growing that human being intellect, growing that human being's social, emotional, spiritual, and all those other areas that you mentioned, you need, mothers are there, the first teachers. So using this discipline of educating is very important for parents, both parents. We both have roles. Allah has already defined the role of the father, the maintainer, provider, and the protector, which allows the mother, as a nurturer, to do what she does best, which is to nurture that new life that comes through her. So when both parents understand the responsibilities that Allah has placed on both of them, and seeing that this new life is cultivated and developed, then parenting becomes more, what's the word I want to use? It becomes more successful, I guess we could say. Then we don't find children not really knowing how to conduct themselves, or what being insulted or upset because somebody calls you a bad name, so, but parenting is very important. So, but once we understand what the role that Allah has given to us, the importance of the intellect and cultivating the mind, then we can become better parents. And I hope that answers your questions to some degree.
My definition of education has evolved as I have evolved in my life. My first introduction to education in our home was always open discussion, but you couldn't just talk, you had to substantiate what you said. I can remember being very young, my dad used to say, well, tell me why you said that. Explain to me what makes you think that that's correct, so we couldn't just say things. That was not permitted. So my first education was when you said something, you had to substantiate it. As I grew, my concept of education grew, especially when I was introduced to the language of Imam Muhammad. And then he began to say, be careful of oppressing your children of saying to them, don't do this, don't do that. Good manners is important, but there's a difference between good manners and always telling your child not to do something. He said, because leave room for what God is developing them to be. So as I grew and understood the language of Imam Muhammad, I have a 28-year-old, and my consistent conversation with her is to look for God's message to her, what she has given herself to, not what I think, but I use the foundation of my education is to ask her, what substantiates why you believe that? So education to me is having the ability to find who you are, your purpose of being created, and being able to substantiate it by really identifying opportunities, real experiences in your life who make you who you think you are. That's what education is to me.
Alhamdulillah. And with that, we're going to wrap up this panel presentation. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for participating and sharing your experience, your knowledge, and your wisdom. And thank you so much for being an active audience. We're going to take a quick break, but before that, if we can get a couple more takbirs for our panelists. Takbir! Allahu Akbar. Takbir! Allahu Akbar. Takbir! Allahu Akbar. Thank you very much. We'll just take a very, very, very brief stretch break, and then our next workshop will begin. Don't go away. Just take a quick stretch break.